The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another FLA webinar. Tonight, we're lucky to have on board Dr. Dana Thomas from the CSIRO talking to us on the nutritional value of modern crop stubbles. My name's Peter Haviland. I work for the webinar coordinators, Aggregate Consulting. And before we get into the presentation tonight, I'll do a quick bit of housekeeping and also introduce a little bit more about our speaker. So I'll just share my screen with you, bear with me. Okay, as we said, we're looking at that crop stubble tonight. In terms of housekeeping, if you're not familiar with the webinar platform, essentially you need to just worry about your arrow there, which allows you to collapse or reinstate the control panel. So when we hand over to Dean, you'll want to be able to see the full screen. So I suggest minimising that. Again, down the side here, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions, so keep them coming through. Don't wait until the end, and it'll allow us to prioritise or group up those questions. You'll be able to hear us, we won't be able to hear you, so don't worry about mute. And if you have to leave early, please complete the survey at the end, and you know that this webinar will be available within a couple of days, generally during the week. So, yeah, if you have to step away, you can catch it back up. As I said, we've got Dr. Dean Thomas from the CSIRO with us this evening. Lucky to have him on board with to cover off some new work that's been done in the West around crop stubbles. So a little bit on Dean. He's based in Perth, originally from a farm on Ravensthorpe on the south coast of WA. And as you can see, he's got a fairly long list to his resume and areas of expertise. So field research, farming systems, modelling and sensors. Dean's had a good chat today with Dean on tech and how it relates back into both research and on-farm management. And then, yeah, background-wise, he's heavily involved in, obviously, mixed farming systems and the role of livestock and cropping and how it overlaps. So I think that's enough from me. I will now hand over to Dean, and we will have about half an hour with Dean, followed by some questions. Thanks for coming tonight. All over to you now, Dan.
Thanks, Peter. Just putting up the slides. Is that coming through all right?
Looks good, Dan.
Excellent. Oh, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining in. And I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors at the bottom of this first slide and the funding. So this was part of a recently completed project called Modern Stubbles. So quantifying the feed base in grazing system remains a challenge for us, and stubbles are no different. It's be quite difficult putting numbers around how much feed's available and what sort of performance you're going to get from stubbles. So on that basis, we've within this project looked at a range of different ways of getting at that. So we've engaged with farmer surveys, with field surveys, some laboratory analyses, animal health studies, and also brought together some field studies which go back a decade or so with grazing experiments. So a smorgasbord of stubble information there, and I'll share some of that with you tonight. So just by way of background, we're in 2021, there was about 21 million hectares of winter crops that went in, and this chart just shows you what types that were the main ones. And of that is estimated that about 30% are grazed, so around about 6.5, 7 million hectares of stubbles get grazed. So, and so it's an important part of the feed base. So based on some survey results, we're able to look at the proportion of time that sheep are spending on different feed-based components on a mixed farm. So you can see there that stubbles do make up a significant amount of that time during the season, sort of second only to your annual base green and dry pastures. Of course, that's going to vary quite a lot from location to location and different farming systems, but this was a sort of typical mixed farm in a Mediterranean type of climate. So these are some photos of us going out and about collecting a range of samples. We're also supported by the by grower groups and farmers sending in stubble samples for analysis. In the end, we put over 300 samples through our lab, which gave us a pretty good picture of what the nutritive value of stubble and chaff material was. One of the things that came out was that there's some quite large differences in chaff management at harvest, and this chart here captures some of that. So, based on the survey respondents, we could see that about half of farmers are still distributing chaff out the back of their header, but there's quite a lot of aggregation of chaff material as well into heaps and windrows. You can see that makes up the fairly good proportion of the remainder, and some less prevalent practices as well in terms of using a seed destructor and also baling chaff straight out the back of the header. So from the chaff samples that we collected, we sorted those, as you can see there in the photo, into different components. So we separated out the grains and then also separated the material into the main stem and then the finer stem and leaf material and then the fine material. And that was the basis that we used to conduct the nutritive value assessments of those different components. So this chart here shows the composition of that stubble based on how the chaff was sourced. So for example, in chaff heaps and lines, there's a pretty small proportion of the main stem, the large material. So that was down around sort of 10 to 15%. But if you take just a quadrant cut of your stubble, either on on the interrow, the off row there, or from a stubble that's just had the chaff spread across it, that main stem makes up a dominant proportion, so up to about 50% in that case, and the small and medium components you can see make up the rest. There are a smaller amount of the overall stubble biomass. We also had a bit of a look at the grain content of what was in the chaff samples. So a couple of main points there. Overall, the amount of grain that we found was a bit less than we'd expected based on some of our other field surveys. So, for example, wheat was only really represented at about 6 kilograms per hectare in the samples, based on those couple of assumptions we've made there at the bottom. And the amount of barley grains in barley crop chaff was about 7 times higher than wheat. So yeah, the amount of barley grains getting through into the chaff was really high, and would certainly have implications for the grazing value of those chaff piles and chaff lines. So just getting down to some of the nutritive value results. This chart here is showing the metabolizable energy content of the different chaff components and crops. So the general finding was that, and it's probably not too much of a surprise, that the energy content of these materials is really low, pretty much across the board. So the line at 7.5 megs there is representing roughly a maintenance requirement of a dry ewe, and you can see that the loop and fine stem and leaf material and fine material is heading up towards that, but most of the other components were for the other crops were well below that. The main stems were the lowest quality, so that would explain why sheep can be very selective in eating flag leaf and other finer, high nutritive value components of stubbles, which they're very adept at. And the main stem of the barley was actually about a 1 megajoule per kilogram dry matter higher than for the other crops. So barley seems to be a little bit better overall, would be the conclusion there. So this is a photo of our chaff feeding experiment, where about 1.5 kilos of chaff was put in front of these sheep after they went through an intensive training period to get them used to eating that type of material by hay and the like. They weren't overly keen on eating that really low quality chaff, as you might expect, but they did perform valiantly and did the job for us, so that was good. We had mature and young ewes in the experiment, and we were offering them this chaff material with and without lupins. So we offered chaff from 9 different sources, and then measured their intake and their diet selection and the quality of the feed that they were eating. So some results from that experiment showed that they, as I mentioned, they were able to consume a reasonable amount of chaff across all the different chaff types. There was some variability and chaff source effects, but they weren't really that significant, and it sort of indicates that all of the animals were well trained and basically eating up to their intake requirement. Their fibre constraint requirement on intake. And you can see across the bottom there that the young ewes and mature ewes were eating reasonably similar amounts in total, despite the young ewes being about 15 kilos lighter. So on a per kilogram live weight basis, the young ewes were eating quite a bit more chaff. So a few more of the results summarised from this experiment. The young ewes were calculated to have a 30% higher intake of chaff on a per body weight basis. And this amount of chaff was only meeting about 1/2 for young ewes and 1/3 for mature ewes of their daily energy requirements. There was some diet selection going on. As I mentioned, there was about 1.5 kilos being offered, and only about half of that was being eaten. So we made sure that they didn't eat at all, was the idea. So it was ad lib intake. And that the thing was that because all of the components of the chaff are fairly low quality, even with some diet selection, they weren't really making huge inroads. So they were selecting about a 6.2 megajoule diet and leaving behind 5.8 megajoules. So it was significant, but it wasn't a large difference. The amount of selectivity depended on the particular chaff and the age of the ewe and whether or not lupins were offered with the chaff. Younger ewes were more selective, and also the sheep that were offered lupins were more selective. And we can't really explain that. That's sort of counterintuitive, other than maybe they were spending more time searching through the chaff for lupins. I was just wanting to move on to some of our results from field experiments and summarising some of that, because that's been quite important in the development of a stubble grazing calculator, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So I've just got a short video clip of sheep grazing stubbles to show you that. So these use graze very selectively, as I've alluded to, and they are selecting out grain and fine, higher quality components of the biomass on offer, and they're really avoiding those main stems. And over a period of grazing of about 6 weeks, what we find is that the energy intake of the ewes is coming about 50% from the grain that they're able to select out, the unharvested grain, and the other 50% of their energy intake is coming from those higher quality leaf components and stem components in the stubbles. So they're leaving, and it's probably about 10% of the material that's there, and they're leaving probably about 90% behind. So these charts here sort of describe some of that. We've taken biomass cuts from 4 paddocks here under grazing. So you can see the cuts were taken at a number of intervals during that period of stubble grazing. And for the leaf and stem components, they're representing kilograms per hectare there, and it was quite difficult to see any trend at all in that biomass. It was being trampled, but it was still there. And they weren't really putting much of a dent in that material in terms of eating it. So this is for wheat stubbles where we've measured this. On the other hand, the grain, we can see that that's being depleted over time. So typically, we can see here that there's about between 100 and 250 kilograms per hectare of grain that was left in these paddocks. And over time, that's reduced down below 50 kilograms per hectare in all of those plots. These are some of the live weight and livestock performance, the sheep performance data from the ewes on these stubble trials. You can see there's aggregated a number of different trials that have been run over quite a time. So these are just some information about each of those specific trials, but the main point there is just to have a look at the differences in the estimated amount of DSE grazing days per hectare for those used to return to their initial live weight that they were when they were put on the stubble. So what we found was that on average there was about 116 DSE grazing days per hectare available from stubbles, which is the equivalent of 1400 megajoules of ME per hectare. And that was under no supplementation on wheat stubbles again. So just to draw your attention to the point about what's happening with these ewes when they're on the stubbles, they'll initially gain weight rapidly, consuming quite a lot of the spilt grain quickly, and then reach a point at which they're really just maintaining weight. And if they get left there for longer, they'll start losing that weight that they initially put on, just as the stubbles become depleted of grain and other high quality components, and left with that low quality material. So this is a calculation here that we had a look at what the value of wheat stubbles based on this research, what the value might be in terms of a typical mixed farm. So if you've got a farm where you're cropping 60% and you've got 40% of pasture on the rest of it, where 2/3 of your cropping is wheat, then our calculation here is that we are providing the stock with potentially 2.8 terajoules of energy in that system of ME. But we know that we're not going to get full utilisation of that from some previous work. So, and that's just based on how the system works and the time delay between sequential grazing of different stubbles. So we're going to lose some of that value. So probably only be using 45%, which gives us 1.3 terajoules of energy available. So then if in this system, if we've got 400 ewes that are going to be requiring 4,250 megajoules of ME per ewe per year, then that's a total energy requirement for that sheep system of 17 terajoules of ME. The bottom line there is that the wheat stubbles in that mixed farming system are providing about 8% of that total ME requirement for ewes in a mixed farm. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, just to round out this talk, I just wanted to draw your attention to a sort of an Excel spreadsheet-based stubble grazing calculator that we've developed as part of that Modern Stubbles project. So I'll just talk through it now, but I guess the main outputs that we're using the calculator to determine are the grazing days that are available from a stubble under the scenario. So we've got over there in column D both the days that the mob can graze until they reach a live weight gain target, which is set, and in this case it's been set as 0, so that means the sheep have reached maintenance in that paddock. And the other field is the mob days until live weight reaches the initial live weight, where they've gained weight but then they've lost the equivalent amount. So you can see in this example here, we've got 26 days of grazing on stubble determined until they are maintaining live weight, and then they've got 56 days until they have returned to their initial starting live weight. And so the fields that need to be put in for these, and this has been specifically developed for wheat stubble grazing. So you need to put your live weight gain target that you're interested in, because that will then affect your prediction. The condition score of the ewes, the live weight of the ewes. I just should mention that I've used 1.8 here as a condition score, but that's probably much lower than what you'd want to be heading to. So I'll just pull myself up on that now. The calculator does take into account the extra energy requirements for pregnant ewes, so we can put a value in there for how many months pregnant the ewes on the stubbles are, and often that is the reproductive time of the season when ewes are out grazing stubbles. And then we can put information about the paddock and the mob size as well, and there's some further options for including supplementary feeding in that scenario. So just to use this calculator to run an example, if we've got 200 dry merino ewes with an average weight of 58 kilograms and 2.4 condition score, grazing them on a 50 hectare wheat stubble, and our aim is to maintain their body weight. So moving the ewes when their live weight returns their initial live weight. And so if we run that scenario, and then we consider a further scenario about how much longer would it take to reach this target if the ewes were being fed some lupins after the first 14 days that they're out on the paddock. So they probably at that point would start to need a bit extra protein. So first run of that calculation, you can see all those values input into the calculator there. Gives us an estimate that those ewes will return to their initial live weight at 41 days. And then with the supplementary feeding scenario we've got, we can see that if we are to offer them lupins from day 14 at 200 grams per head per day, that's going to give us an extra 20 days of grazing that stubble at a cost of 8 cents per ewe per day. and there's some information there about the breakdown of the energy coming from the stubble versus the supplement as well. So 22% of the energy under that scenario is coming from supplement. So I'm going to wrap it up there. So just to round it out, given the low quality of a lot of the stubble components, we do need to make sure that those higher quality components are available there. You can expect that fresh wheat stubbles should be able to provide more than 100 DSE grazing days per hectare without supplementation while maintaining new condition. We found from our nutrient value results that barley, chaff contained a lot more spilled grain compared with wheat. And just to return to my starting point, that feed budgeting on grazing systems is a challenge, but there's the opportunity to be as quantitative as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. That was very insightful. It's good to put some numbers to those different feed values. And yeah, in dry conditions, no doubt your tool's going to be used both in the west and on the east coast. So we've got some questions. Keep them coming through, and Dean will be online to answer these. I should say Dean's also made his calculator available. So that will be up on the MLA website, but if you contact me, I can send that through.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
So,
yep.
Dean, can you just put your summary back up? A few people have asked for that. Yeah. Thank you. So our first question, Dean, is around where the study was. Is it WA data only or across Australia?
Yeah, so it was WA only in terms of the samples that we collected. The survey itself, we opened up across Southern Australia, most of the experimental work and the collection of the samples was constrained to WA. We had a chat about this earlier, Peter, and probably my comment in terms of what some of the main differences might be in terms of quality. I'd say that generally West Australian stubbles might actually be slightly higher in nutritive value because particularly in seasons where there's terminal drought and you don't get that translocation of nutrients through to the grain. So in regions that are more soft finishing, I would say that the stubble quality of the actual stems and leaf material would be lower. So these results come from quite a wide range, from fairly high rainfall areas through to low rainfall areas. So we do have that covered in the study.
It's good to know. Now, it seems like we've got a few oat fans out there. Just a general comment, there was no data on oat stubbles available. Is that correct? Dave?
Yes, we did measure a few oat samples, but it made up a very small proportion of what we collected. And oat stubbles from harvested oat crops, so not hay, tended to have the same characteristics. There was some that was slightly higher in quality, but again, it was nothing that would differentiate them too much from a barley stubble or something like that.
Yep. Okay. Now, a query around your calculator in terms of, I think the plus side of it is it's very simple. There's been some queries around do you have scope to put in dry matter per hectare or kilos of grain per hectare or target ground covers to incorporate that in?
Yeah, so that hasn't been built in yet. It would it's definitely recommended with stubbles to take a few measurements of how much grain is out in the paddock. That would be able to guide decision making on how much feed's available a little bit more. Interestingly, with our field experiments, we didn't find very strong relationships between the amount of grain out there and the amount of DSE grazing days we can get off the stubbles. But just it would make sense that the more grain that's out there, that the more confident you could be that you're going to be able to graze for a bit longer. But no, the calculator is very much the average of a number of field studies. So it's hitting for that center point, and it just provides that extra way to estimate what might be going on in the scenario. So there's certainly, it's not intended to lock in a certain amount of grazing time. Your other sort of management practice still needed for that, but it will just allow you to compare what different stocking rates and different paddock sizes, and use field published research as a basis for estimating how much grazing value you can get from a wheat stubble.
Excellent. So I've got a few questions I'm going to group up here, Dan. Obviously, in the scenarios you've put up in the calculator and the research, you're using a high quality feed supplement, being lupins. There's a few questions about, how would you feel that would translate if you're using a lower quality kind of protein like urea blocks, etc.?
Oh, urea. there's a little bit of I've found when I've looked for it that there's been some conflicting sort of results from studies on just your raw sort of nitrogen based supplements. So I'll leave that one alone a little bit, but in terms of providing a supplement, it's just important to make sure you're meeting the protein requirements of whatever class of stock you've got grazing. So if you've got a mature ewe, you'd be looking to make sure that overall protein's around 11%, 12%, something like that. Whereas if you've got lambs, then you'd be wanting a fair bit higher than that, so 14 or 15% protein. And you're not going to meet that with the chaff by itself, or probably even the wheat grains in some cases. So once that's depleted, then yeah, supplementation of protein will be pretty important.
Yeah, okay. Hopefully that covers it off, guys, just what you've asked there. A unique situation from David here. Would you think in the case that you have a harvest situation such as lodgement of crop, is that a consideration given the higher, grain availability that we need to consider? So have you come across any metabolic issues in your work?
Yeah, so it's probably a chance to plug a stubble grazing booklet that's associated with this project as well. So in that we do go into a few of the other challenges to look out for with grazing stubbles, and one of those is acidosis. So if you've got a high, even just a normally harvested crop, then you do need to make sure that they're adapted if there's a fairly high grain content. So distributing the grain a bit, making sure that they are sort of familiarised or adapted a little bit to some grain feeding before they go into the stubbles. Some of the other common practices are putting them onto an oat or a barley stubble first before wheat, which is obviously a bit more problematic. So those types of things, but yeah, I'd be very cautious about putting sheep directly into a lodged wheat stubble. It would just need to, they just need to acclimatise. They could do that slowly. Yep. So, and the positive though is that they would be still mixing their diet up with a lot of other lower quality materials, so the wheat heads and chaff and all of that as well. Yep, but just that period of adaptation initially, just to give yourself a bit more confidence, is pretty important.
It sounds like that resource you've got available will be useful as well, Dean, so we might put a link up for that. Is it available in soft copy?
Yeah, that's available online now. So yep, we can certainly get that link out. And that, yeah, just towards the end of that, there's a range of different sort of things to watch out for with stubbles. You know, water requirements, some other specific issues with grazing lupin stubbles, which may or may not be done so much over that way. And yep, so definitely that's another resource for people looking to drill down into a little bit more detail.
John, I'm not sure about your question here, so hopefully I get it right. Have you looked at the potential of having some sub-clover? So I'm guessing potentially undersown sub-clover in with the crop rotation?
Yeah, that would definitely be a positive from providing a bit extra nitrogen and higher quality. Yeah, there was a producer in the Northern Ag region of WA over here that has got a really robust system where bicerula pasture and cereal cropping is integrated. So that was one of the things that they were looking at in 2021, because they had really high levels of early rainfall. So they had a full soil profile. So they had these sort of self-regenerating bicerula pastures, which is not completely different to a sub pasture in terms of it's fairly hard seeded, but it handles a false break a little bit better over this way, which is why it's gets a bit of use up that way. But yeah, they had their idea was to sow a crop into that without killing it off and just letting it tick away underneath, because the legume will grow a lot slower during winter, and then harvest the crop at the end of that, and then have that bicerula available in the stubble to improve your stubble feeding value, which it would do. So, you know, the dry legume would probably have a protein content of 14 to 18% protein, whereas your stubbles didn't really show too much protein data tonight, but yep, they're down around 4 or 5% protein content. So that's a real challenge with that material.
Okay. And final question here, a good one, Dean. Chris would like you to explain your DSC grazing concept a bit more. So in the example he's got here, you say 100 DSC grazing goes per hectare. What would that mean for a mob of 500 sheep in 50 hectare, in a 50 hectare paddock? Let's put a class to that, Dean. Say dry
Yep. So so a 60 kilo dry ewe would be equivalent to something like 1.2 DSE. And of course, this is what I've got the calculator for, so I don't have to do these calculations in my head. But so you'd expect to be able to graze at 3 ewes per hectare. So yep, you'd do the math on that one, and you'd probably end up with sort of 40 or 50 actual days of grazing. So but the adjustment, so one DSE is basically a 50 kilogram dry ewe or weather, so that you have to adjust the requirements around that, and then around your stocking rate as well. That'd be the main considerations for doing that calculation.
And as you point, yeah, it's not kind enough to do those kind of calculations in your head at this time of night. The calculator's there for. All right, so thanks for all the great questions, everyone. The few of you who've requested the calculator, I'll send that out directly to you. And thanks for joining in. Thanks, Dane, for a great presentation, and some good questions and some insightful answers. So please complete the survey as you leave, and we'll be back in 2 weeks time, and I will get the dates right this time around in the email, so apologies for that. Our next presenter will be Dr. John Webb-Ware from the University of Melbourne, and a timely webinar on livestock staggers on phalaris and ryegrass-based pastures. So we're moving towards that kind of high risk seasonal condition, late summer, early autumn. So again, timely that we look at that in a webinar. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great night.